Hi, it's Dwyer. October 27th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. You know, folks, there's never been this much money in the heavyweight division ever. Now, with that in mind, and we'll discuss it, did Joe Parker, who was in line for a shot at heavyweight champion Alexander Usyk, did Joe Parker make the right decision by fighting Fabio Wardley first? Right? Hindsight's 100%. We understand that. Let's go beyond hindsight and let's just think about life, think about his situation, think about purses, think about the risk involved. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, Joe Parker reached his career high in terms of his purse in March of 2018 when he received $10.4 million to fight Anthony Joshua in a unification match. Parker had a share of the heavyweight title. So did Joshua. To fight in Cardiff, just understand, Joe Parker made a career high, $10.4 million. Now that's very important because he wasn't living hand to mouth since then, right? He received the big purse. So these fights might not have the same meaning for him that they do for some heavyweights who have not gotten the $10 million payday in the past. Now understand how life works, right? You don't realize it until you're well into it. Joe Parker today has 6 kids. He has 2 kids who have been born in the last 12 months. Right? So he has 6 kids. I know there are many parents watching this video who remember looking at a child and thinking about how you needed to take care of that child. You wanted to get the college fund in place. You wanted to set things up so the child was living in the safe neighborhood. Maybe not the edgy neighborhood that you like to hang out in as a younger person. Right? You realized your life had to change. You had to make sacrifices. Right? Now, Parker is with a longtime partner. Right? So this is different than some of the drama, especially professional athletes have, where there's baby mama number 1, baby mama number 2, multiple families, court orders, and the like. But just understand, Parker has 6 kids. Now, he had a fight scheduled with the reigning heavyweight champion, Daniel Dubois. And that fight didn't happen. Dubois supposedly had respiratory problems. Right? I think those respiratory problems, one cynic would argue, might have been related to the offer Dubois got to fight Alexander Usyk. But just understand, Dubois backs out of the fight. And Parker then gets the opportunity to fight Martin Bakole. Bakole's dangerous, but Bakole took the fight on just a few days' notice and didn't have the benefit of a training camp, right? At least not a full training camp. Right? When Bakole took the fight, he wasn't even in the country where the fight was to take place. And for that fight, for that risk, Joe Parker picked up more than $2 million. And that risk delivered. Because, of course, Parker got the knockout win over Bakole. They're contemporaries. Right? Parker right now has the advantage. Critics of Parker can't claim that Parker avoided Bacoli, right? Even though Bacoli, as I mentioned, didn't have the benefit of even a couple weeks' notice for the fight. Well, I want people to understand the money involved in boxing today. By historical standards, it's off the page. It's one of the reasons why the heavyweight division is the deepest I've seen it. For his 2022 rematch against Anthony Joshua, Alexander Usyk received his career high purse, $30 million. Right? That was for the 2022 rematch. Now, just understand, for the first fight against Tyson Fury, Fury received $105 million. When you subtract out taxes and other fees, managerial fees and what have you, onlookers believe that Fury received $70 to $75 million. Usyk was to receive $45 million, but he had incentives in his deal, and they delivered. Right? He became the heavyweight champion. So he actually received $52 million. This was for their first fight. Right? Just understand, Daniel Dubois, for his first fight with Usyk, this is the infamous, was it high or was it low, body punch fight. Dubois received $2 million. Right? That's the first fight. For the second fight, Dubois received $71.22 million. Right? The second fight, Dubois is the reigning champion. Usyk received $132.8 million. Let me also backtrack a little bit. For the second Tyson Fury fight, according to reports, Usyk received about $114 million. Right? So, folks, the money at the top is big. But understand, to get into the party, right, when you're fighting the reigning heavyweight champion, you're not going to get as much for the first fight. Right? Daniel Dubois got $2 million to fight Usyk the first time. Right? $2 million. Now here for this Fabio Wardley fight, just understand that Joe Parker was guaranteed $3 million. Right? $3 million. A guy with 6 kids. Right? $3 million. And let's be clear here. I know the fight went differently than expected. Let's all appreciate the difference. In the fight before, the consensus view is that Justice Hune was well on his way to a victory over Fabio Wardley. Right? You don't quite know what you're facing until you are in the ring. But Wardley, let's just say, was being methodically outboxed. One wondered what Wardley's strategy was. Right? Hune seemed to be picking when to come in the pocket. Hune backed up Wardley, had him up against the ropes at times. Wardley looked beatable, even though at the time Wardley was unbeaten. So Parker took $3 million, which is more money than Dubois got for his first fight against Usyk. Right? And it was the second highest purse of Joe Parker's career, behind the $10.4 million he got in March of 2018. He lost the match. Let me just say, things are tricky. You understand the money really follows certain fighters. Right? Fury, $105 million for the first Usyk fight. Right? 105. Without him, Usyk wouldn't have gotten the huge money he got, $52 million for that fight. Right? Which was a far bigger payday than he got for his rematch against AJ in 2022. Right? The big money's on the back end. And so, just understand, Parker got the huge purse. When you're dealing with older champions, guys who have already validated themselves, guys who have victories over big name fighters, and who you understand were the best heavyweight of their era or on the very short list and were likely headed to the Hall of Fame. You understand that this is the sport where such champions, let's name one, Lennox Lewis, after really one of the best performances, well, certainly one of the most memorable fights of his career, after a victory over Vitaly Klitschko, right? Lennox Lewis walked away. Understand the purses associated with Lennox Lewis, what Lewis was bringing to the table, walked out the room with him. Right? So Joe Parker, in addition to having an opponent who looked beatable, big punch, but let's say a boxing style where a Parker who had already beaten the guy with a big right hand, Deontay Wilder, by outboxing him. Right? A Parker thought, you know what, I've already diffused Deontay Wilder. Why can't I diffuse Fabio Wardley? Parker also had to measure the risk involved. And folks, I understand fighters say a lot of things. I know Usyk has said he wants to fight until he's 41. I've heard him, right? But you need to understand that the way things work, some guys, even the very best, will just flatly decide not to fight a mandatory. They will fight other people. I need for people to go back in history and look at Ray Robinson. Right? How many folks know that Ray Robinson got stripped of his belts because he refused to fight the mandatory? But yet that's what happened. And what's interesting is that the public hasn't held it against him. In other words, people talk about Ray Robinson and they don't say, oh, but he ultimately got stripped of his titles because he didn't want to defend against the mandatory. Right? If Usyk in this era, where there are other credible opponents, isn't Kabayel unbeaten? Right? How much money do you think Usyk, who got $114 million for the second fight against Tyson Fury, how much money do you think Usyk would get for a third fight against Tyson Fury? Right, folks? Usyk has options. I understand the boxing hardcore. People like you and me are thinking, hey, he should fight his mandatory. Usyk already, as you might recall, was undisputed at heavyweight and then lost the belt. Right? Didn't, work out the deal to keep that belt. He later wins it back in the ring, but you remember Usyk's undisputed before Dubois gets a share of the heavyweight title. So Joe Parker is dealing in the world of high risks. Usyk could pivot toward other fighters. Right? Wasn't there a time when Riyadh season, Turkey Al Sheikh, said, hey, he wasn't interested in backing Joe Parker? Didn't that happen? Google it. Right? What happens if Riyadh season says, hey, Usyk, fight Kabayel? Right? Kabayel is based in Germany. Hey, let's have this fight in Germany. This is part of our global expansion. Let's get Riyadh season into more countries, etc. Right? Just understand, I know Joe, as a mandatory, would be a deserving mandatory. I think we all know that. But I think an Alexander Usyk at this point, he's already proven to you more than once he could be undisputed heavyweight champion. And Alexander Usyk at this point, I believe, after 2 9-figure paydays, the second Dubois fight is his career high. He made $132.8 million according to reports. After 2 9-figure paydays, he doesn't have to take the highest bid for his next fight. Right? He can fight someone who he feels comfortable in fighting. George Foreman flatly would not fight Tony Tucker. Right? We've talked about this earlier here. Ray Robinson would not fight Charlie Burley. Right? There are certain fighters that other fighters say, hey, I don't want to fight that guy. Rightly or wrongly. Right? Floyd Mayweather Jr. would not fight Antonio Margarito. Then, of course, we found out that Margarito was putting plaster of Paris on his gloves. Right? That led to sanctions against his trainer. So Joe Parker, who's been heavyweight champion, who was heavyweight champion before Usyk, right? Joe Parker, who's on a run through the heavyweight division, beating up guys Usyk knows, right? Martin Bakole has stories about sparring with Usyk. Martin Bakole did not make it to the 3rd round against Joe Parker. I believe Parker, in fact, I believe the entire heavyweight division should have real concerns over whether Usyk, who is financially comfortable, right, after these paydays, he should be financially comfortable. They should have concerns over whether Usyk is going to stay in the building. Right? If Usyk decides to fight Tyson Fury again, right, and I just want people to look up how many times Ezzard Charles fought Josie Joe Walcott. Right? If they decide to fight each other yet again, that's a multi-million-dollar fight. That's a fight with market power. Are you certain Usyk would get as much money fighting Joe Parker? Right? Parker might have been uncertain. The risk reward might not have lined up for Usyk, who could have fought others. You know who's trying to get back at Usyk? Daniel Dubois. Right? Think about that from the Usyk side. Usyk, I'm sure, understands that low blow, was it a low blow fight, is one of the iconic moments of his career. He also knows that he can move away on demand from Daniel Dubois, that Daniel Dubois gets discouraged. Right? Look at the effort Dubois gives to get off the canvas after he's knocked down the 2nd time by Alexander Usyk in a heavyweight unification match. And compare that to the effort Thomas Hearns showed when he was knocked down by Marvin Hagler. Right? Hearns gets dropped. You say, oh, that's it for Tommy. Then suddenly Hearns gets back up because that's who he was. right? He's fighting Marvin Hagler. He, is dazed, confused, hurt, dropped early, and he gets up. That's not Daniel Dubois, right? So when Usyk could think to himself, hey, Dubois wants to fight me a third time, right? Some sanctioning body is going to order me to fight Dubois. And understand, when you're undisputed heavyweight champ, there's so many sanctioning bodies. You could actually look like you're complying with a sanctioning body while you're dodging the other's mandatory. So Joe Parker may have thought to himself, if I beat Fabio Wardley, who was getting dominated by Justice Hune, dominated, if I beat him, that makes me stand out from the crowd even more. At a minimum, I get $3 million, the second biggest payday of my career. That's at a minimum. So if Usyk avoids me, and understand, Usyk actually got extra time to negotiate with Joe Parker because he supposedly had some injury, but then was later filmed in a nightclub dancing. Right? Think about it. Right? If, Joe Parker suspects that because Riyadh season is not financially supporting him, and that Usyk might decide to pivot elsewhere for a more glamorous purse, right? Just understand, the boxing hardcore, what's more glamorous than a guy fighting his mandatory contender? Right? That's the way we think. That's not the way the public thinks. Right? The public, they're going to think, oh, yeah, that's right. Fury got a split decision. Loss to Usyk. I thought that fight was Fury's fight. I want to see that fight, even though Fury has not been active since that last Usyk fight. Right? The rematch where Fury loses by a couple of rounds, at least in my opinion. Right? That's what the public wants to see. Right? They aren't in the weeds. I don't see the people in the public screaming for any American right now. Richard Torres, Zhili Zhang, Deontay Wilder, to have a shot at the title. Right? They'll overlook the fact that Torres is unbeaten. Right? They'll overlook the fact that, if Usyk gets hit once by a Wilder right hand, that might be the ball game. If we're hoping Fabio Wardley has a puncher's chance against Usyk, there are other great punchers in the heavyweight division. Right? So, from my seat, I believe life's complicated. I believe you have to factor in the Riyadh season announcement that they weren't interested in a Joe Parker fight. You have to factor in the idea that Parker just watched Wardley get outboxed by Justice Hune. Right? You have to think about the fact, too, that Parker might have felt that he needed to distinguish himself from other heavyweights to force Usyk to stay in the sport and to fight him. Right? To give Usyk the kind of purse that Usyk was able to get against Fury multiple times and against Dubois multiple times. Right? So I don't fault Parker. I understand he, on paper, was this close to fighting Alexander Usyk. Right? I myself would have stayed out of the sport, demanding my shot on Alexander Usyk. You know how they used to do it. right? Just watch the movie Rocky, right? You know, they have a scene where guys are in the crowd, right? Joe Frazier is at a fight between Apollo Creed and Rocky Balboa, right? I remember watching, you know, some light heavyweight matches, and Matthew Saad Muhammad, when he wasn't fighting, always seemed to be sitting in the crowd before a fight. And they used to show the crowd, not just for the celebrities, but they would also show fighters who were at the fight. Not on celebrity VIP tickets where the fighter's actually from a different weight class, but no, they would actually show guys who wanted a shot at the title being fought for in the ring. Right? If I were Joe Parker, being a child of the 70s, right, I would have, you know, called out Usyk every 5 minutes. If Usyk abdicated, I would have picked the belt out of the garbage, figuratively speaking, right? Isn't that where Riddick Bowe threw it? Another champ who would not fight Lennox Lewis because they did fight in the Olympics and Lewis beat him, right? I would take the belt out of the garbage. I would show up to weigh-ins, right? If Usyk's going to overlook me, even if it's for more money, if he's going to overlook me to fight Tyson Fury, my buddy who walked in the ring with me here, or to fight, you know, Daniel Dubois, or to fight Ajit Kabayel, right? I would show up to the weigh-in, right? You know the way guys do it. This is the Jerry Buss, former owner of the Laker technique. You just show up and you stand around. Eventually, some reporter is going to come up to you, right? And, of course, you then, you know, look like you're begrudgingly giving an interview when you have real things to say. That's the way I would have played it. But I can't fault a guy in boxing for saying, hey, I'm not going to wait on this champion. I got $3 million of easy money here. Money he thought was easy. Against a guy who just had a fight where he was thoroughly outboxed but for his last punch. Right? When Hune comes in a bit recklessly defensively. Right? Parker, of course, also beat Zhili Zhang. He's aware of the risk involved. He got knocked down twice in the Zhang fight. He could have lost that Zhang fight. Right? So he has 6 kids. He decided to take a $3 million payday here in a sport involving champions who have walked away on top. That's what Lennox Lewis did, folks. Lewis had many men he could have fought after that Vitaly Klitschko fight, including Klitschko in a rematch. Lewis decided to walk away. Right? Here's Parker. He's thinking, gee, if Usyk, the undisputed, walks away, what would I get for my next fight? Especially if it's box off to be champion. Right? As happened in boxing in the late 60s when Muhammad Ali got kicked out of the sport for, you know, supposedly dodging the Vietnam draft. The Vietnam War, right? You know, Parker may have thought, gee, if the undisputed won't fight me, walks away, lets belts hit the floor, and if they then order me to fight Fabio Wardley for the belt, right, what would I get paid? Probably about $3 million, which is what he got paid here. So it is prize fighting. I don't blame any fighter for taking the prize, especially when, you know, they have real life situations, right? 2 kids in the last year and stuff like that. 6 kids, 6 mouths to feed, right? I don't blame Joe Parker, but it was a big risk. And it did cost him. Let me also say, too, let's be very real here, right? You understand that Joe, assuming his eye isn't badly hurt, right? Joe won in a sense because now his name's front and center. Let's say Fabio Wardley fights Usyk and beats him, becomes the undisputed heavyweight champ. They're going to be members of the press who, you know, Wardley's giving a press conference. They're going to say, what about Joe Parker? Right? You can imagine every time Wardley fights, some press guy is going to peek over Joe Parker's hedge, have a mic, have a camera, try to get Joe Parker's opinion on whatever Fabio Wardley's doing. Right? If there's an up-and-coming fighter who wants to earn their stripes and they need to fight someone credible, and they understand they aren't close enough to the front of the line to call out the heavyweight champ. Let's say Richard Torres wants to fight someone credible. Folks, Joe Parker, we know now, is one of the most credible guys to fight in the heavyweight division. Right? Parker said he's going to continue in his career. Folks, he's one of the best athletes in the sport. Right? Just to understand, his athleticism may have betrayed him. Someone who, in that 11th round, understood the optics were bad. Right? Some guys in front of you, your back's up against the ropes. He's throwing a bunch of heavy shots. He's a heavy-handed guy. You know, what's Parker doing? Parker is reading and moving and stuff. He's doing the stuff that freak athletes guys do. Right? It's like, oh, this guy's throwing big shots. The lesser talented guy would say, let me clinch. Right? Let me clinch. Let me get off the ropes at a minimum. Right? Joe Parker's on the ropes. He has enough balance to be slipping shots and stuff like that. But he wasn't aware of the optics. Parker, 33, one of the best athletes in the sport. Heavyweights age more slowly. Right? Parker was outboxing Wardley as it was. Right? It's not really until the end of the 10th round where you felt, wow, you know, Parker is in trouble here. He gets staggered at the end of the 10th round. Right? And when I say the end of the 10th round, I'm talking about the last 25 seconds of that 10th round. Right? That's the only time where you start to think, wow, you know, Parker might be at acute risk in this fight. I know the scorecards say differently. Had it gone the distance, and had the fight been called a draw or been called for Wardley, you could imagine the level of controversy we would have had. Anyway, those are my thoughts. It was a risk. I wouldn't have taken it, but I understand. Right? There's no guarantee that, you know, Wardley, let's just say, there's no guarantee that Usyk was going to necessarily fight Parker, even though Parker was the mandatory for a sanctioning body. Right? Given the fact that Riyadh season had announced that they weren't going to back Parker financially. Right? That increased the odds that the Parker-Usyk fight would not happen. Parker wanted to take the $3 million here and now against a fighter who was unbeaten, coming off a fight where he was outboxed. Really one of the worst showings of Fabio Wardley's career. Right? That's how I see it. He took the risk because there was risk involved in terms of waiting to fight Usyk. Let me hear from you. I look forward to your comments. Thanks for stopping by.